people living in Europe need to stop apologizing for what they are. What they are, what their culture is, their history is good. It's something to be celebrated and to be preserved and defended, not destroyed or discarded. The fight with Hezbollah is an existential battle, which is why they desperately need American military support in the air, missile support and so forth, and whatever else we can provide. But unless he intervenes to say, that's it, you can't do this, we won't support you, then I don't see much hope for a positive outcome. Then I think it becomes a death struggle, and I'm not sure Israel will survive. I don't know how you get to peace as long as you start from the standpoint that Russia is the aggressor, Russia is evil, Russia is bad, and Ukraine must join NATO. There's no future for that. The uniparty is the problem. All of these people are funded in one way or another by many of the same big donors. In other words, Washington is donor-occupied territory.
Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Buitink, and welcome to a new episode of Reinvent Money, a podcast about money and geopolitics. Today returns to the show retired U.S. Army Colonel, author, and political commentator Douglas Macgregor. Good to see you again, sir.
Good to see you.
Our video of April was watched over 600,000 times. You shared so many incredible insights in that video, so I look forward to picking your brain again today.
Good.
First, I would like your take on a few very recent explosive events. First off, the situation in Venezuela. I'm getting mixed signals. On the one hand, we see people suffering from Western sanctions and meddling, and some signs that it's just another Western regime change operation. On the other hand, I see an awful leader, Maduro, who claims to communicate with his predecessor, Chavez, through little birds. And he's a guy basically who a lot of Venezuelans really hate. I also know plenty of Venezuelans living abroad who are fed up with his economic and crop policies. So what's your view on the situation there? And will Maduro survive this?
Well, keep in mind that I do not claim to be a Latin American expert, and my knowledge of the region is not as good, let us say, as what I'm prepared to talk about in the Middle East and certainly Europe, especially Central East Europe. But having said that, I agree with you. The signals are rather mixed, and the current unrest, especially involving the National Guard, which numbers about 25,000, suggests that, yes, the CIA may well be involved in stirring things up. And I'm not saying that because I necessarily think Maduro is a blessing. Maduro, on the other hand, has restored some measure of productivity and created a degree of order in the society that was missing. That's not, once again, to say that I necessarily endorse him. But I think the problem in Latin America, in most cases, is usually blamed on us, the United States. That's a mistake. Latin America's problems are largely manufactured at home by the people that live there, just as most of our problems inside the United States are manufactured by us. But we do have an unfortunate habit of dabbling down there and meddling, and that's a legacy of many decades of CIA penetration and intervention. So we'll have to wait and see what happens next. Venezuela is rich in resources and should, under normal circumstances, be a very successful leading country in the world. But you could say the same thing about Argentina. And again, you have to look at the culture, look at the people that live there, and then you begin to realize that many of their problems, if not most of them, are really manufactured at home.
Yeah, same thing with
more.
Yeah. Same thing with Ecuador, for example. I used to live in Ecuador, and it's a country full of resources, oil, commodities, everything grows there. You just have to throw something on the floor, and a tree grows.
Well, you just said something that's very important because this comes up all the time for discussion, particularly in the woke world that we increasingly live in. Why is it that being rich in resources makes no difference if you live in Ecuador, Venezuela, or even in Argentina? Argentina, at the beginning of the 20th century, was one of the richest countries in the world. So what happened? You have to look at the people, their culture, their society, their way of life, the way they see the world, how they behave. Look at Norway. Norway today is arguably one of the richest countries in the world. It disposes over almost limitless resources in key things like natural gas, oil, rare earths. I could go on and on. Every time you trip and fall down somewhere in the mountains of Norway, you discover phosphate or some other desperately rare mineral that everybody wants to pay billions to own. Well, the Norwegians are Norwegians. Take the Norwegians out of Norway, put the Ecuadorians into Norway, and it will fail. I hate to be blunt, but that's the truth. So people make all the difference. And that's true in the Netherlands. It's true in all the countries in the world. You know, if we talk about the occupations of Germany and Japan after World War II, lots of buffoonish Americans like to stand around and say, well, we brought democracy to Germany. We brought democracy to Japan. Well, that's all a lot of nonsense. And what ultimately happened was we did provide some capital to get things started, but we let the people that lived in those countries rebuild the countries themselves. So if you want to know who restored Japan and Germany after World War II, it was the Germans and the Japanese. I mean, one of the most interesting anecdotes that I ever heard from American soldiers who had served in World War II was that as they were withdrawn from Germany across the continent, they left, they were on the Czechoslovak border, the particular group that I spoke to. And as they left, they moved across Germany and all the way back to ports in France, where they took ship and returned to the United States. They said what was really stunning is that by the time we withdrew and we were going back through the cities, which in many cases we had fought, the Germans had already cleared all of the roads. All the rubble was being piled up neatly. The Germans were in the streets working to restore and rebuild everything. When we got to France, nothing had changed since we left.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm Dutch, as you know, and I today actually I was in Rotterdam, which was completely leveled, of course, during the Second World War. But if you see how we built up the country in the 40s and the 50s, it's just amazing.
Precisely, but that's because you're Dutch. And people living in Europe need to stop apologizing for what they are. What they are, what their culture is, their history is good. It's something to be celebrated and to be preserved and defended, not destroyed or discarded. Anyway, I'm sorry to be preachy about that, but I think it's somewhat important right now.
Yeah, no, good point. Let's move to the Middle East. Things are heating up again there after a rocket hit a soccer field in the Golan Heights, killing 12 kids of the Druze community. There's a lot to unpack here. Of course, Israel has been occupying the Golan Heights since 1967, but of course that doesn't justify killing dozens of innocent kids. Can you tell us a bit more, first of all, about the Druze community? What kind of community is that?
Well, the Druze are not, strictly speaking, Muslims, and they are not Jews, but they are Arabs. And their religious, cultural orientation makes it impossible for you or I or anyone else who is not born into a Druze family to ever become a Druze. So by definition, there are limited numbers of them on the planet. They unfortunately have been stuck in the middle, usually between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. In this case, they're between Jews, obviously, in Israel, and Muslims. But keep something in mind. Many Druze have been very good Israeli citizens. I have met and talked with Druze who served as officers in the Israeli army, even some who became general officers. So they are more integrated as a part of Israeli society than probably any other non-Jewish group. In fact, I've heard many Jews say, well, they're really Jews, you know. They should be just like us, but for some reason they're Druze, but they're really Jews. Who knows? But the Arabs don't regard them as enemies, and they haven't made war on them. So this whole thing was a tragic accident from the standpoint of Hezbollah. What happened, we now know, in fact, the Israelis have admitted to this, is that an Iron Dome missile that was designed to deflect or defeat an incoming Hezbollah missile instead knocked it off course, and it fell by accident on top of the soccer field. So the real culprit in the minds of the Druze right now is not Hezbollah. They see the Israelis as being responsible for this. It's all unfortunate. And as one of the women that was interviewed on the soccer field where these children were killed said, look, this needs to stop. This is accomplishing nothing. The war accomplishes nothing. It merely kills people. there's a lot of wisdom in what she said, but she's speaking as a Druze, as someone who's in the middle that is really not interested in the fight at all.
Yeah, and of course the result is a more retaliation, more casualties. As we record this podcast, retaliation strikes are taking place, and it seems like the number 3 of Hezbollah, Fuad Shukr, was just attacked in Beirut. I'm not sure if he died or not, but do you expect escalation going forward, or maybe just like in April after Iran attacked Israel, that things sort of stabilize a little bit over the next few days?
No. First of all, this was not a retaliation because none of the people killed were Israelis. And the people trying to kill the people in Lebanon, the Arabs that are there, the Muslims and Christians, are Israelis. So this was not to retaliate for the Druze losses. That's nonsense. This is part of a larger plan that Mr. Netanyahu came to Washington with, and which he briefed to key members of the Senate and the House. And this is the plan to invade southern Lebanon with the objective of destroying Hezbollah and essentially seizing control of all the territory up to the Litani River. And they've flatly said if anyone is south of the Litani when they attack, they risk being killed because they will regard everyone and everything they meet as the enemy. Now, those are things said behind closed doors. But the bottom line of all of this is that Israel is determined to realize this objective of greater Israel. Israeli soldiers are now walking around with patches on their uniforms that show the map of greater Israel. In other words, Israel with the West Bank and Gaza completely in Israeli hands and potentially up to the Litani River. Now, I didn't get a close enough view to see if that patch reaches all the way to the Litani River. It may. But it certainly eliminates the Arabs that are currently living on what Israel considers greater Israel. So that's the plan. That's the objective. That's where they want to go. And they are absolutely convinced that with American help, support, and assistance, they will be successful.
And how much of Lebanon is that if they would take that much land?
You've got to look at the map. Find the Litani River. The Litani River is south of Beirut. And the Israelis have been there before. They've crossed it previously and gone all the way to Beirut. It was an unhappy experience. And after having occupied southern Lebanon, this creature we call Hezbollah was created largely as a response to the Israeli occupation. So when Israel leaves in 1982, it is Hezbollah that is the legacy of their occupation. I think that's something we in the West don't pay much attention to. I mean, that came up for discussion, by the way, in 2002 when there was planning underway for the invasion of Iraq. And most of the senior military leadership did understand at the time, I'm talking about the U.S. military leadership, that occupation of Iraq by a U.S. and allied European force would not succeed because it was an alien entity that would be rejected by the Muslim Arabs. We are seen as Christians. Whether or not we all are is another matter, but that's the way the Arabs view us. So I think the Israelis learned the hard way that there is no benefit to occupying Arab societies. So now that apparently the new option is to eliminate the Arab society, and then the land belongs to you. And they think there's no alternative to destroying Hezbollah. And the only way to do that is scorched earth all the way to the Litani River.
Like they did in Gaza, basically, the same strategy.
Now, I would expect the same thing to happen. The problem, of course, is that how do you isolate this from the rest of the region? It's not possible. And earlier today, Erdogan, who has thus far been a disappointing blowhard to most of the Muslim world, has finally said, we won't tolerate this. If Israel goes into Lebanon, we will enter the conflict. Now, how that happens and what he precisely means, I don't know. But the Turks have always been the gorilla, what we call the 500-pound gorilla in the corner. And the Israelis have sort of dismissed the Turks out of hand as never really coming into this, and no one should worry about it, and focusing instead on Iran. But the truth is, the Turks and the Iranians are very, very different people. The Turks have a very strong martial tradition. They are a warlike people. and they are deeply offended by what the Israelis have done to the Muslim Arabs in Palestine, notwithstanding the fact that lots of Arabs are suspicious of Turks for reasons of history and the Ottoman Empire. But I think today, certainly the Arabs, Sunni and Shia, would welcome Turkish intervention as an alternative to Israeli destruction.
And the Turks, of course, would also get a lot of extra refugees should Israel decide to enter Lebanon. Yeah.
Oh no, I think that's a critical point. Somebody said, "Well, what do you think has happened with Mr. Erdogan?" And I said, "I think in his latest meetings with the National Defense Council, senior officers have been very blunt and said, if the Israelis go into Lebanon, they will destroy it. If Lebanon is destroyed, we are at high risk in this country from all sorts of strategic outcomes. And we will be seen or viewed throughout the Muslim world as traitors, as having helped the Israelis effectively destroy the Muslim peoples of Lebanon and Palestine." So I think he's finally pushed into a corner. And I think he was trying to send a signal that we will act. And I think it would be a mistake for the Israelis to dismiss this out of hand.
Yeah, because then we get into a very interesting situation. Should Israel get into a war with Turkey, Turkey being a NATO member, how is the US going to respond to that?
Well, NATO is not a terribly meaningful entity anyhow. We pay lip service to it all the time. It's a sort of, monument in the corner. Everybody genuflects to it because they want you to believe it's important and so forth. But in truth, no, I think NATO is in shambles. And I said in January of 2022 that if we went ahead and provoked Russia into this attack, made it impossible for the Russians to not stay out of Ukraine. And if you remember, the Russians tabled many, many proposals for discussion. We rejected all of them. We out of hand said no. We wouldn't even look at them carefully. That left the Russians no alternative. And I think that's the problem now with the way we are doing business in the Middle East. We have unconditionally signed on to support Israel. Now I think there are people in the White House, fewer on the Hill, because the Hill is not a place where people think carefully about anything. But in the White House and certainly in the Department of Defense, people are very concerned because you're looking at an alignment now with not only Turkey, but also Iran and virtually all the Sunni Arabs in the region against Israel. And if Israel strikes hard against the Turks and or the Iranians, it's impossible for the Russians to stand by and ignore it. The Russians are not going to allow Iran to go under. I don't think the Russians would allow Turkey to go under. Russia has an interest in stability in the region. And I think that's what Russia wants. And I think that's the message from China. This enormously important meeting with the Chinese that was recently held as part of the Shanghai Cooperation Council or organization. It involved the various parties to the Palestinian cause, not just Hamas, but the rest of them. And the goal was not the destruction of Israel. The goal was we've got to have stability in the region. There has to be a settlement. That settlement has to be imposed. The United States cannot do that because of its unconditional support for Israel. So I think everybody else is looking at this from the standpoint of what can we do to avoid a war? And the United States seemed hell-bent to ensure that there will be a war. And that continues regarding Ukraine as well.
Yeah, and China, of course, also has every reason to not want a war there, because if Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz, then China is also in economic trouble.
Well, you've got to look at the Belt and Road Initiative. We treat that as some sort of Trojan horse for Chinese imperial power to conquer the world. China is not interested in that. They don't have a history of that. The only time China was aggressive was under its Mongolian emperors, and that's because the Mongols had already conquered the place. China is by no means interested in that. The Chinese have enough trouble governing themselves. Remember, there are probably four versions of the United States inside China. If you're President Xi, you wake up every morning with a headache trying to figure out, how do I hold this thing together? How do I prevent some warlord in some corner of China from striking out on his own? How do I control the mass corruption that is a pandemic inside China? I mean, these things we don't pay any attention to them because we Americans don't think about anything seriously beyond our own borders. And it's a mistake. China is not in a position to wage war against anybody. And the Belt and Road Initiative is designed to extend Chinese economic influence, to guarantee markets and access, to trade goods. I mean, China was, at least as far as I can tell, for most of the last 3 or 4,000 years, always the richest country on the planet. People forget that. So, oh, the world is changing. Asia's in charge. Well, with the exception of the last 300 plus years, China's pretty much been the richest country in the world, which is why everybody attacked it, occupied it, tried to conquer it, and use it. So we shouldn't be surprised by this. But there's an unwillingness to see something like that in anything other than a negative light in Washington. Washington wants to sort of be the colossus that bestrides the world. It's a very dumb idea. It's unnecessary.
And do you think that with, let's say, Kamala in the White House, given her sympathy for the Palestinians, things could stabilize in the Middle East?
Yeah. Well, if we're going to talk about American politics, strap on your seatbelt and get ready for a very, very rough ride. If you look at the three sort of political directions right now, one is obviously the what I would call the committed left under Kamala Harris. At least she's a nominal head. Then you have Donald Trump, who is supposedly to the right, but it appears to be the prisoner of corporate interests and banking systems and financial gurus and the Israel lobby. And then you have this third candidate, Bobby Kennedy, who is really a nationalist, who is worried about the United States, who wants to focus attention on what we need to do here at home and wants to largely disengage from conflicts and crises overseas. So he's really quite willing to engage for the purpose of settling disputes and disengaging American military power. President Trump seems to want to continue to be engaged and maintain the quote unquote empire and imperial posture. And I think Kamala Harris, she bills herself as leading, quote unquote, the party of color. And if you look at the demographics of the American population, and you figure that about a third of people living in the country are non-Europeans now, that can only be a divisive force designed to threaten the so-called white people. And you've got to remember that her whole platform that she stands on is really built on the same sort of Antifa, Black Lives Matter mentality that discards the past as fundamentally flawed, inherently evil, because it's white and it's Western and it's European, and therefore it's bad. It's straight out of Karl Marx's manifesto. Strip everything out and start over. She wants to start from scratch and build this new world with people of color largely in charge and running the show. What a hell of a mix you've got. You've got three candidates like that. They could not all be more different, but the only one who talks substantively about solutions to the housing problems, to the financial situation, to the enormous sovereign national debt, to the endless overseas military commitments and warfare, is Bobby Kennedy. Everybody else, even though she says she's the party of color, she's not willing to get out of Ukraine. She's unwilling to do anything very differently in the Middle East, regardless of what she says, because the people around her are overwhelmingly in the Israeli camp. The same thing is true for Mr. Trump. So it's a strange thing. It's like Trump on the one side and Kamala on the other are both wings of the same uniparty. And then there's one candidate in the middle, but he is actively suppressed by the mainstream media.
Yeah, he's only
suppressed
getting
by the
airtime.
mainstream media. How can he get his message out?
Yeah,
it's very tough.
I mean, he's getting airtime from the alternative podcasts like Joe Rogan and the others, but that's not enough yet. Maybe in 4 years, or but right now mainstream media, of course, are still dominating. But what's the percentage of people that could possibly or are going to vote for RFK? You think,
I
realistically?
think that he could get at least 22 to 25%.
That's a lot.
Depending about what happens over the next 2 months, he could get as much as a third or more. What he needs to win is about 34%. At that point, he will have enough to pull ahead of both of the opponents because they will be reduced to about 30% to 33%. I mean, we've been through this before. We went through similar elections. We went through this with Abraham Lincoln. He went in as a dark horse, as a sort of minority candidate, taking positions at the time that one would probably compare with Bobby Kennedy's. He was not an advocate for war at all. He was an advocate for finding a solution to preserve the Union. He decried slavery and thought that it should go away, but made it abundantly clear that his first cause was to hold the Union together. So he was by no means some sort of radical figure, but there were others at the time running against him who were. Miraculously, he was elected.
Yeah, interesting. And going back to the Middle East, just to sort of write down the solution. And the solution would, of course, be some sort of a deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But doesn't Hamas hold the key by if they would release the hostages? Would that be a first step towards some kind of arrangement, treaty?
The problem right now is that a great deal of blood has been spilled. Blood in Ukraine and blood in the Middle East. The more blood that is spilled, the more difficult it becomes to reach any sort of accommodation. Right now, I see no evidence, no matter how much the Israelis may or may not like Netanyahu, that the majority of Israelis are ready to compromise on much of anything if it involves the emergence of an independent Palestinian state. At the same time, so many Muslim Arabs and Christian Arabs have been killed and brutalized. There is not a great deal of willingness on the part of the Muslim Arabs for compromise. In fact, I think the elites in the region, people like the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and others, are very much at risk because their populations are enraged by what has happened in Gaza, absolutely enraged. And if they are viewed as betraying Muslim Arabs, and right now there are a lot of people who see them in that light, particularly in the Saudi royal family, they won't last. Those elites will be swept away. This is, of course, General Sisi's problem. It's also King Abdullah's problem. They're seen in that light. And I think the same force is dragging Erdogan kicking and screaming out of a neutral stance into an active participation stance vis-a-vis Israel. So asking what kinds of steps can we embrace? I don't know. But the one thing that has to happen for any success to occur is for the president of the United States to restrain Israel and prevent it from invading southern Lebanon. I see that as probably the last straw. If the Israelis go into an all-out war with Hezbollah, and that's what it would be, because both sides understand it's a fight to the finish. That was made clear to me when I was last in Israel. I mean, the fight with Hezbollah is an existential battle, which is why they desperately need American military support in the air, missile support, and so forth, and whatever else we can provide. But unless he intervenes to say, that's it, you can't do this, we won't support you, then I don't see much hope for a positive outcome. Then I think it becomes a death struggle. And I'm not sure Israel will survive.
Well, let's just hope that everyone involved understands that this would be a fight to the death, and no one is going to win that. I mean, there won't be real victors after a war like that. It will be total chaos and with ramifications for everyone. So let's just hope people get their senses back and start to negotiate some sort of solution.
Arguably, that's what people thought at the beginning of the First World War. The president of France was asked in August of 1914 how long the war would last. And he said, well, I think probably until February or March. And they looked at him and say, why is that? Because that's when the money runs out. That was not an unreasonable statement for him to make. Well, what happened? Well, part of the problem was that the British Empire decided to bankrupt itself. And then we stepped in. We opened our credit markets to the British and the French. So they had endless credit, or so they thought. And eventually, when it became clear they were going to lose, and we were going to lose billions because we had invested in them, we entered the war, and the rest is history. So what you think at the beginning is not going to last long frequently turns into the death struggle. And I think it's kind of an exercise in what someone called competitive collapse. And I think the Israeli economy is already in ruins. And I don't see how Israel survives if it opens and widens the war. Even if we do come in and provide some measure of support, even if we fly strikes against Hezbollah, which is what they want, or we utilize our naval power in whatever ways to launch missiles at them. Once Iran and Turkey enter the fray, it's very unlikely that Israel will survive, even if Iran is the only one. Because again, Russia will not sit idly by. This is the problem. And, I'm always amazed at the readiness in the United States and Washington to just wave the hand. Oh, that's not a problem. You're wrong. You can't possibly be right. European history teaches us otherwise.
Yeah. Now let's go to that other war that's lasting or taking longer than a lot of people initially thought, the war in Ukraine. Could you give us an update on the front? Because we still see small territorial gains from Russia. We do see Ukraine being successful at doing some deep strikes within Russia, oil depots, radar stations. Even in the north of Russia, an airplane was taken out by a drone. Maybe let's start there first. Was that a Ukrainian drone or was it a NATO drone?
Increasingly, we've begun to doubt that actually happened. Because we have satellite photography that does not show any evidence for any destroyed aircraft. And they were talking about a Tupolev 22M3 bomber, a supersonic bomber, essentially something on the lines of the B-2 that we built. And we were looking for the wreckage because we were given this report. And ultimately, we've traced the report back to Ukrainian intelligence. And so we've begun to think this is another, what's the right word, a false report designed to create the illusion that the Ukrainians have some fight left in them, that they can reach out and harm the Russians and so forth. The truth is the Ukrainian army is largely in a state of collapse. Now, the next question is, well, if that's true and the Russians are moving west, up and down the entire front, they're simply moving forward. They're taking their time. Because, again, what no one in the West understands is that Moscow does not want to rule Ukrainians. That's very important. People don't seem to get that because there's this big lie. The big lie at the beginning is, well, this was an unprovoked attack by Russia. Nonsense. We began decisively provoking Russia in April of 2008. At the Bucharest conference when we said Ukraine will join NATO. It was completely unnecessary. When I was at SHAPE headquarters, we all gave thanks for Ukraine because we said Ukraine is the neutral state that puts 500 to 600 miles between NATO's border and the Russian military, even though at the time we weren't worried about the Russian military because it wasn't very large. And Putin was not focused on building up a large military force. Now, when he goes into eastern Ukraine, he does so because in the interim, once we installed the new government in 2014 in Kiev that was anti-Russian, and we then began building this Ukrainian military establishment, he rushed to control Crimea for obvious reasons. He didn't want that to become the new naval station for NATO, which means that the U.S. and Royal Navies begin docking in Sevastopol. So that was a defensive measure. And plus the fact the majority of people there were Russians or Tatars. And those two groups would much rather live together than be under Ukraine. But then he began looking at what was happening in eastern Ukraine. And you've now heard Washington talk about we're going to put what we call theater ballistic missiles into central Germany or Western Poland. In other words, we can put them there, and that puts them within 10 minutes striking range of the Russian nuclear arsenal. Well, they were afraid that that's what was going to happen in eastern Ukraine as we built this extraordinarily well-equipped, well-trained Ukrainian army between 2014 and 2022. At the same time, remember that as soon as the new government took over in Kiev, the Ukrainians began shelling Donetsk and Luhansk, the so-called rebellious provinces, breakaway provinces where the population was Russian. And the Ukrainians had been trying to Ukrainianize the population in eastern Ukraine. You can't speak Russian. If you do and you insist on Russian culture, then you will be treated as a second or third class citizen. If you were a Russian, you had no shot in a court of law. Your property could be taken from you. I can just go down the list. So if you look at all of those things, they had no alternative but to go in. But when they went in, everyone said, oh, this Russian army is terrible. It's not doing very well. It's so small. It's too small for the job. Well, I don't think the Russians did badly at all. I think they were restricted in what they were told they could do. But the one thing they were right about was, yes, it was a very small army because there was no intention on launching offensive operations against the West. So suddenly, when things go badly by the summer of 2022, what do we hear? Oh, Putin is going to seize all of Eastern Europe. He's bent on conquering Ukraine and once Poland. It's all nonsense. The biggest problem with seizing control of all of Ukraine is simple. It's full of Ukrainians when you cross the eastern border, the Dnieper. He doesn't want them. They don't want him. And here's news for them. He doesn't want them. But he does want it to be neutral. He doesn't want to fight this war and then see it end with the possibility that we will return to what's left of Ukraine one more time with the goal of turning it into a battering ram to be used against Russia. So the preconditions for talks with Russia is the acceptance up front that Ukraine has to be neutral. And of course, that's what we thought was an advantage back in 1999. Now it's being treated as a leper colony if it's not part of NATO. So it's quite insane. So I don't know how you get to peace as long as you start from the standpoint that Russia is the aggressor, Russia is evil, Russia is bad, and Ukraine must join NATO. There's no future for that. And if you look at the most recent peace plan put forward by Mr. Pompeo, the former Secretary of State and CIA director under President Trump, it's pure comedy because it does exactly that. Oh, we'll talk to the Russians as long as they prostrate themselves in front of us. And in the meantime, we're going to strengthen sanctions. We're going to double down on more military aid to Ukraine, lift all restrictions on their use of military power, and then we'll talk to the Russians.
Yeah. And what do you make then of Zelensky? Also recently, a few times, even also this week, he's talking about that he expects the hot war to end before the end of the year. Is he also cooking up some peace plan or his staff? Are they actually devising something already, talking to the Russians or intermediaries about a ceasefire or anything like that?
I think Zelensky would like to survive, and therefore he is open to things that he will not admit to in public. There are people on the ground in Ukraine talking with the Russians. The Russians know what's happening in Ukraine. And so the Russians are advancing all along the front, but they're doing so slowly because the ultimate goal is to wind down this conflict. And I would say easily a third of the Ukrainian forces they encounter are ready to surrender. Another third is ready to just leave the battlefield. There are very few people who really want to fight. This includes the committed neo-Nazi types who have refused to attack on numerous occasions now over the last several weeks. So the situation in Ukraine is desperate, and the population there, it may not be widely known in the West, but my sources tell me that they absolutely loathe and hate Zelensky. They've begun to wonder whether or not Zelensky's real goal is to exterminate Ukrainian manhood, because he's doing a pretty damn fine job of that right now.
His polling numbers are still high, relatively high.
I don't believe that.
No.
I think that's nonsense. I don't think his polling numbers are high at all. And I think the truth will come out at some point. It's like everything else. Uh, After the Vietnam War finally ended and we all flew away in our helicopters, people said, well, how many Vietnamese did we kill? We said, oh, well, maybe 250,000. Well, it took another decade, but it turned out 2 million Vietnamese were killed.
Yeah.
In other words, we lie about everything until we can't lie anymore. And that's the way of Washington's war fighting. And that's what we're doing right now everywhere. We're lying about everything. And it's a very dangerous thing to do because when you lie like that, you're bluffing. And somebody's liable to call your bluff. That's where we are now.
Yeah, you talked about Pompeo earlier, and he admitted, of course, that he was lying and cheating when he was the CIA director. So he's even blunt about it. And maybe a final topic, Colonel, we didn't talk about last time, but I would like to know a little bit more about your own initiative, Our Country, Our Choice. What's that all about, and what does it mean for an American? Of course, I'm not an American, so it's not relevant for me in that sense. But what does it mean for an American to join your organization?
Well, Our Country, Our Choice was founded not by me, by others. I was simply invited after they founded the organization to come in as the chief executive officer, and I've tried to do a reasonable job in that position. It's not easy because one of the terms of my contract is that I cannot endorse any particular political candidate because the organization wants to be bipartisan. The people who started it said, look, this Democrat Republican thing no longer works. The uniparty is the problem. All of these people are funded in one way or another by many of the same big donors. In other words, Washington is donor occupied territory. We have to be a third force, a new force. We want to unite Americans across party lines. We are essentially nationalists who believe in the Republic. We believe in the Bill of Rights. We certainly support the Constitution. But most important, we have certain issues around which we rally. Number one, we've got to control our borders. They have to be secured. That also means we have to restore the rule of law inside our country. Criminality has reached new highs in too many of our largest cities. And of course, as many of your audience will realize, we lose about 110 to 120,000 American lives every year to fentanyl poisoning, most of which pours through the southern border. So we've got to get control of that border. And that also means we've got to put the United States Army back on that border where it was from 1846 until 1948. Mexico is an organized crime state. We have to face that. Cuba, Venezuela, and Mexico are the sources of most of the drugs and much of the criminality that is eating away at our foundations for the Republic. So we've got to control the border, number one, and restore the rule of law. Number two, we have to end and disengage from these overseas conflicts. We've spent trillions and trillions of dollars. I've seen estimates anywhere from 10 to 14 trillion dollars wasted on these conflicts. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and more recently, we've been very active, as I'm sure some of you may know, in Africa, until we were thrown out of most of the Central African countries where we were operating. And the interesting thing is that after having been thrown out of Mali, for instance, Ukrainian military advisors showed up to help the Islamists, the very people that we were combating. And they have successfully killed 75 Russian mercenaries who came in to replace us in Mali. So it's a very interesting set of circumstances. It sounds like somebody in Washington decided, well, we tried to defeat the Islamists. We were then thrown out. The Russians are there now. So now we'll work with the Islamists. And we did that, of course, in Syria in the hopes of dislodging Assad from power. We did that in Iraq with ISIS, surprisingly enough. There's so much confusion about what actually happened over the Middle East. It's beyond belief. And a lot of people don't realize these so-called Iraqi militias, which are overwhelmingly Shiite, actually helped us to drive the Sunni ISIS Islamists out of Iraq. But more important, they liberated large numbers of Arab Christian communities that were on the point of being exterminated. So now we've turned on the Shiites and said, but you're still evil and you're agents of evil because you're funded in part by Iran. Therefore, you are the enemy. I mean, this is the sort of lack of reason and logic that drives things in Washington. So we want to end this. We want to get out from under it. And we want to come to some sort of agreement that we need a new government. We really do. It's not a question of drain the swamp and eliminate a few people. We've got a major surgery that's required. And we have a military establishment, of course, that's an anachronism. It's a tribute to the Second World War. And it's a bottomless pit for dollars and resources. We can't even recruit for it because the people that you want won't serve in it anymore because of all this diversity, inclusion, equity nonsense. Then we want to stop the sexualization of children, dead in its tracks. This is very, very bad. And what you saw at the opening of the Paris Olympics, in many ways, exemplifies everything that we loathe and despise and want to destroy. So that's our country, our choice. And we think that there are lots of Europeans out there that should be interested in the same thing. We hope that in time we'll be able to invite our country, our choice chapters, if you will, all over Europe, because we think the Europeans are facing the same dilemma. And we got to end this self-loathing complex that seems to affect all of us. Stop apologizing for the things that we've done and created and get back to business, rebuilding prosperity, restoring the economy. In fact, we need today what I would call redevelopment economically, both in Europe and the United States. So that's it in a nutshell. I hope that's enough.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot for explaining, and people can read more about it on your website, ourcountry.ourchoice.com, and we'll put it in the show notes. Well, thanks so much, Colonel, for catching up with me. It's always very interesting to learn from you, to hear from you, and to better understand the geopolitical mess that we are currently in. Hopefully, we can do it again in a few months.
Sure, unless I'm removed for some reason. Yeah. Hopefully I'll be here, but all the best to you. And remember that everybody in the United States loves the Netherlands. You're not going to hear anything negative about the Dutch. We all do. We all love and admire the Dutch. So it's time for the Dutch to go back to loving and admiring themselves.
Make Holland great again. Yeah, exactly.
That's right. Thank you.
Thanks, Colonel.
Right. Bye-bye.